Senator Brown.
Acting Deputy President, I rise today to make a contribution on this important piece of legislation introduced by Senator Keneally, the Immigration Amendment New Maritime Crew Visas Bill 2020. In doing so, I acknowledge, sadly, that this debate would not be necessary if the federal government did its job. For 8 long years, this government has refused to act and close one of the gaping holes in our national security regime. They have ignored advice from their own officials about the growing security risks posed by foreign crews working on flag of convenience vessels off Australian shores. What makes this situation even more deplorable is that at the same time, this government is refusing to let our own citizens return to Australia, refuses to let Australian citizens leave the country without permission, and recently threatened to jail Australian citizens attempting to return home from India. But if you are a foreign crew member working on a flag of convenience, you are currently issued with a visa for entry into Australia within 24 hours with no security checks. Compare this, Acting Deputy President, to the security checks that Australian seafarers and maritime workers are forced to endure, waiting for up to 3 months for their Maritime Security Identification Card, MSIC. This bill that we're debating here today is aimed at fixing the hole in our national security regime and protecting Australia's borders and the Australian people. In 2018-19, authorities estimated that 72% of cocaine, 83% of cannabis and 72% of amphetamines seized that year had come through our maritime ports. Yet this government still refuses to conduct proper background security checks on foreign crew entering our ports. In July 2016, the International Transport Federation alerted Australian Border Force officers to the berthing of a flag of convenience ship at the port of Gladstone. The vessel was crewed by Syrian nationals, but only one of them had a maritime crew visa, only one, and that one visa was issued for an earlier voyage. In other words, the ship had been permitted to dock without the necessary visas in place. And after the ITF's intervention, all of the Syrian crew were issued with visas and rights to unescorted shore leave. Prior to the ship's arrival, no one knew who was on board or what, if any, security risks they posed. This is not an isolated example. The ITF presented evidence to the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee of 10 vessels that had been in violation of Australia's temporary licensing arrangements. When officials from the Department of Infrastructure were asked about these breaches, they confirmed that they do not have officers on the ground to ensure that foreign flag ships are complying with their temporary licence obligations. The department has also confirmed that they have only detected 5 breaches of temporary licences since they were introduced almost 10 years ago in 2012. This simply isn't good enough. It seems that the ITF are better at detecting breaches of the current licensing regime than government agencies. Counter-terrorism and other agencies have continually identified the potential exploitation of people with access to the secure areas of our port as a risk. But the government has repeatedly failed to act. In 2017, Acting Deputy President, the Department of Immigration and Border Force as it was then, appeared before the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee and gave evidence that flag of convenience ships may have been used in a range of illegal activities, including illegal exploitation of natural resources, illegal activity in protected areas, people smuggling and facilitating prohibited imports and exports. What did the government do when confronted with this evidence over 4 years ago? Nothing. This government did nothing. The departments also raised their concern about the impact of reduced transparency and secrecy surrounding complex financial and ownership arrangements of the flag of convenience vessels. A series of serious border security incidents and the repeated concerns from government departments and agencies should have rung alarm bells throughout the government and prompted swift action. That's what should have happened. It should have rang alarm bells and it should have prompted swift action. Instead, the government's only course of action to date has been to tighten up the requirements on hard-working Australian seafarers and maritime workers. As the situation currently stands, foreign crew can apply for a maritime crew visa online about 24 hours prior to arriving at an Australian port. In fact, it is the usual practice for the ship's operator or a crewing agent to lodge a bulk application as the ship approaches Australia. There are no face-to-photo checks, no background checks, and the visas are issued very quickly. We therefore have very little knowledge of these people arriving in Australia. In pre-COVID times, foreign crews would automatically be eligible for shore leave on arrival. This often involved the crew members being based from the bottom on the gangways to the entry gates of the port. They were then free to roam wherever they wished to throughout Australia. No meaningful checks, no restrictions, off you go. As recently as June this year, 2 crew members from a Panama flagged ship escaped along the foreshore in Geelong. Earlier this year, Senator Sajilja was forced to confirm that the port of Geelong is a secure area and that all people in the zone are required to have an MSIC or be escorted by an MSIC card holder. Yet somehow, at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning, 2 sailors were able to creep down the gangway and set off and disappear into the night. As far back as 2015, alarm bells should have been ringing throughout the government. It was that year that the case of Captain Salas came to the authorities and the Senate's attention. Captain Salas was provided with a maritime crew visa in 2015 and again in 2016, despite the fact that he was being investigated by the New South Wales coroner over 3 highly suspicious deaths as far back as 2012. Captain Salas had given sworn evidence that he had, at the very least, assaulted a crew member and that he facilitated the purchase of guns. Yet, on 24 hours' notice, Captain Salas was able to be issued with a maritime crew visa and was free to enter Australian waters and Australian ports. Again, no background checks were done, like is required for Australian workers. I know this sounds that it just could not be true, that someone who had given sworn evidence that he had assaulted a crew member and he facilitated the purchase of guns would be able to be issued with a maritime crew visa and be free to enter Australia. But it is true. That's exactly what happened. There were no background checks, but of course Australian workers are required to undergo character test, background check, tests as well, but none of that is required for foreign workers. No character tests were carried out, no criminal record checks. This individual, Captain Salas, who had given sworn evidence of committing a crime, was allowed access to our ports. These lax visa arrangements are also in place for crew carrying dangerous cargo into and out of Australia and around our coast. Goods like weapons-grade ammonia nitrate is carried into and out of Australian ports on flag of convenience vessels crewed by workers who are granted visas on 24 hours notice. And if this government isn't satisfied by the Australian evidence of the risks and danger, there's plenty of international evidence they can look to. In the past, some 30,000 rocket grenades were found on a flag of convenience ship operated by a North Korean crew in Cambodian waters. Alarmingly as this is, there is nothing in the current regime that would stop this ship's crew from being granted a maritime crew visa and access to Australian ports. In 2002, Tonga shut down its use of flag of convenience vessels when it was discovered that one of the vessels was owned by Al-Qaeda and that the vessels were being used for transporting weapons, ammunition and crew to Europe. Current maritime crew visas aren't used solely for crew of vessels carrying our imports and transporting our exports. They're also issued to crews of a flag or convenience shipping that move domestic cargo between Australian ports under temporary licence issued under the current Coastal Trading Act. In 2019, there were 8 ships used by Rio Tinto to regularly trade in Queensland waters. 4 of the vessels had Australian crew who were all required to have an MSIC. The other 4 vessels all had foreign crew with no extensive background and security checks. Instead, they were required to have the online maritime crew visas. 8 ships conducting the same commercial work but with much more onerous security requirements on those using Australian crew as opposed to the requirements for the foreign crew. And the purpose of this bill before us today is to address this situation. This bill aims to ensure foreign crew are subject to proper security checks, background checks. This bill will bring the background check requirement for foreign crews on ships with temporary licences to engage in Australian coastal shipping into line with the background checks required for Australian seafarers and maritime workers. Senator Keneally's bill addresses the gaping hole in the Morrison government's border security regime by creating 2 categories of maritime crew visas. The bill creates a transit visa for international seafarers entering Australia on a continuing international voyage. It also creates a maritime crew visa for international seafarers engaged on ships and authorised to undertake Australian coastal shipping under a temporary licence. This new visa will require more rigorous background and security checks before it can be issued. It is estimated 20,000 foreign flag ships with 200,000 foreign crew enter Australia each year. Each and every one of these crew are granted an online visa on as little as 24 hours notice. And as I've said earlier, in pre-COVID times, once their online visa was granted and they arrived in an Australian port, these 20,000 crew were free to wander freely in Australia on shore leave. In addition to this lax visa arrangement, some of the ports these crew arrive at ports where there are no X-ray machines, no metal detectors and no bag checks. The Department of Home Affairs has also confirmed that in some cases up to 20 foreign seafarers can be left to walk through highly sensitive areas of ports where the only supervision and precaution is the use of security cameras. This government has had 8 long years to plug these gaping holes in our national security system, yet still they refuse to act. The government recently passed a number of changes to the Domestic Maritime Security Identification Card to extend the security checks carried out on Australian seafarers and maritime workers, but has done nothing to tighten up on their online visa process for foreign seafarers. I congratulate Senator Keneally on bringing forward this sensible solution to a national security problem, and I urge colleagues to support the bill.
Thank you, Senator.